so in this video I am going to cover how to actually trim on the wheel. So the first thing you're going to do is kind of gather up everything you need, which you're going to need your sponge, you're going to need a bucket of water, which I've got off to the side. You are going to need your pen or needle tool, and you are going to need both the large trimming tool and the sort of smaller double-ended tool. From here, I'm going to just lightly dampen the wheel head, just so it's not completely dry. I don't want it super damp, so I'm just going to wipe that off. And then the key with trimming is to make sure you are at a point that the pot is ready to trim. So the pot should have a little bit of give to it yet. You don't want it to be completely dry. If it's completely dry, don't even attempt trimming on the wheel. So like this one, it's still got some give. I'm going to show you what happens when you try to trim something too dry as well. But I'm going to start with this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the interior and the exterior. I'm going to kind of feel the bottom to see how thick it is, because if it has a really thin bottom, you're really only going to be able to trim up the outer edge rather than in the center as well. Because the goal with trimming is to A, make the shape look as good as possible, and B, remove as much weight as possible. So I'm going to work with this directly on the wheel head. I can kind of use these circles to sort of get this into the center. So yes, you have to go through the process of getting this in the center again, which if your pots aren't perfectly centered, just do the best you can. If they're really uneven on the top, you will likely just have to hand trim those. All right, so how I'm gonna make sure this is in the center is I'm not gonna try to center it up here. I'm gonna center it based on a point a little bit lower down, because at this point sometimes my pots tend to be a little uneven, and yours probably will be too. So I'm just gonna rest my fingers on the top, brace my thumbs together, and I'm going to let my needle tool just barely hit the side of this, and I'll be able to look at the rings that makes, and where it doesn't touch, that's where I'm going to move this piece closer to, because it's touching the points that are further out and not touching those that are dipped in. All right, so I'm going to do that again at a slightly different spot. Okay, I can see the end of that's there, and it ends here, so I'm really close to center, but not quite. And I'm going to keep fussing with this until I actually have this piece in the center, and I'm going a little fast there. Let's slow this down just a little bit. Okay, that's not too bad. So now I'm going to take some small wads of clay, and I'm going to hold my piece in the center, because if I don't hold this piece in the center now, when I go to push on these at the bottom, it's actually going to move the piece. So I'm going to shift my other hand. I'm going to go directly across from that other sort of wad of clay, and then I'm going to do this on the other sides as well. The minimum of these you want to use is 3. Don't go all the way around your piece. It's not really necessary. And now from here, I'm going to go, okay, well, what shape do I want to make this? Like, do I just want to even this up, or do I want to give this more of an arch? What's going to look good for this particular piece? How small do I want the bottom of this to be? So how I'm actually going to do that is I'm going to kind of rest 2 fingers on the bottom of the pot. I'm going to brace my thumbs together, sort of similar to how I throw. I'm just resting one hand on the other. My arms are sort of braced on my legs. And like I did with the outside, I'm just going to let my pen tool make a mark on the bottom of this. I'm gonna go, is that enough? Too much? Based off the shape here, I don't think I can go any smaller, so I'm gonna leave that as is. And that is going to be kind of my guiding line through all of this. So what I'm also going to do, this has a fairly thick bottom, so I'm going to go ahead and make a line further towards the inside. I might adjust that accordingly as I go. But I want to be able to remove some of the material in the middle because it's going to reduce the weight of the piece quite a bit. So now I'm going to use my large trimming tool. Again, I'm going to rest my fingers on the bottom of this piece. And I always trim the outside first before I trim the inside because I need to determine this outside point first. And then when I'm using the tool, I'm holding it sturdy with this hand with my fingers sort of right up against the bottom part of the actual cutting tool. And then I usually also brace my other thumb on the tool as well because this is going to give me control. You don't want to be doing this when you're trimming because if you do this, your pot's just going to be all sorts of messed up. So I always try to keep both hands on the tool. Like this tool isn't so sharp that it's going to cut you, so resting your fingers on it is totally fine. And I'm just going to start cutting away. So this pot is a little bit on the dry side because you can see it's kind of flaking. Ideally, your pieces are kind of, the clay is sort of peeling off as ribbons. I'm going to start at this corner, and I'm going to trim this up until I get to that first mark I made on the bottom of the piece. So it's making sure that this is nice and even, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start trimming up this outer piece to sort of even this up. This is not something you should do super fast. You also should not go super slow, otherwise, as with centering when you're throwing, it's going to kind of end up off center, or your hand's going to wander around. So I can see that this is definitely a thicker point, so I'm going to trim away more there. And I'm going to pause, I'm going to take a look at it, I'm going to go, okay, that's relatively even. I might have cut a little bit more than maybe I should have away, but it's not too bad. And maybe it's something where, because of how much I cut, I want to reduce the weight of this a little more. So I'm going to switch to my other tool, and I'm going to primarily be doing the cutting with the corner of this tool. I'm not going to start straight up against that line, because if I start there, I'm going to end up cutting in. So I'm going to start sort of at the midway. And I'm just pressing sort of down a little bit. And I'm going to slowly cut this away. And now I'm going to even up the side because I can always cut down further. And now I'm trimming away until I'm at my original line. And now I'm going to use the other corner and I'm going to start to cut down. So I'm cutting away some of that corner. Notice how much that changes the profile of this particular cup. I kind of like the straight-sidedness of this. I might round this off a little bit. I'm going to make this foot just a little bit taller. So this area that I'm trimming out is called the foot of the pot because it's the very bottom of it, and it's what the entire piece rests on. So now I'm just using the flat of the blade to cut away a little more of this corner surface. You'll find that a lot of your pots are going to have a lot of extra material in the corners. That's why you always want to feel your pieces before you start trimming, because if you don't, you will end up cutting through them. So now I'm gonna go, okay, what do I need to do yet? So I need to clean up this edge, so I'm gonna trim just a little bit so I can even that up. Flatten it out. And you're just gonna have to try moving your tools in different directions. I'm gonna go, okay, do I like how harsh that is, or do I wanna round it off just a little bit? And I think I'm gonna round it off just a little bit, or angle this a little bit, because I don't like how harsh that edge is. So I'm gonna go at an angle on this corner with the flat of the blade. I'm gonna slow down. Now I'm gonna start to move the blade back and forth a little bit, because this sort of slope has gotten bigger than my tool. But if I slowly move back and forth, you don't want to move fast, because otherwise you're not going to go the entire way around the surface. And now look at how that modifies that sort of surface. All right, so now I've got the exterior trimmed to my satisfaction. I will probably run my sponge over that to clean it up at the end. If I'd have trimmed this a little damper, it wouldn't be quite so dry, and it wouldn't have quite this gritty of a surface. So now I'm going to start in the middle. So as when I move to this small tool on the outside, I am not going to set this down right on that line I'd drawn in the middle, and I'm just going to re-emphasize that line so hopefully you can see it a little better. And now I checked my piece before I started trimming, and I attach it down to the wheel. Because if you take this piece off the wheel to check now, you have to recenter it. So you sort of start back at square one, but you'd be centering based off of these areas you've trimmed, not off of further down at this point. All right, so I just remarked this in. So I've got a little bit of leeway on trimming this. This is where you have to be careful to not trim through your pots. So I'm going to go about like 1/4 of an inch in from my line with the very corner of the trimming tool. And I'm going to start to dig in, and I'm doing so at an angle. And every now and then I'm going to have to pause and clean off my surface, just so I can see. So now I'm going to start to spiral out to meet my line. And then I'm going to start to push in a little bit to make that a little deeper. I'm going to clean this up. And this is definitely on the dry side. I would not try to trim anything drier than this on the wheel. All right, so I'm going to dig in some more. I want to get this out, this sort of very outer edge set, and then I'll take care of the middle. All right, so now I'm going to start to look at the profile. Does the width of this foot match with the rest of the piece? The rest of the piece is kind of chunky, so I actually think leaving a little bit of a chunkier foot is actually okay for this piece. If this was a super fine, delicately sort of shaped piece with really thin walls, I wouldn't necessarily want to have this chunky of a foot, but because of the shape of the piece, this is actually okay. So now what I'm going to do is I need to cut out this sort of raised ridge in the center, and I don't necessarily want to trim it flat. I want to give it just a little bit of an arch, because if you do it flat, it's more likely to crack just because of stress. If you give it an arc, it has sort of a way to support itself. So I'm going to start by cutting in with the corner of the tool at the corner. And now I'm going to actually spiral that corner in to the center. Cutting a little away. I'm going to clean up the surface so I can see what I'm doing. And now I'm going to go back in with the flat of the blade and go across the surface. You can just use the flat of the blade for the entire process. I find it's easier to use the corner first and then trim away. Otherwise, to me, it feels like I spend like 15 minutes trimming the center of this. I'm going to go into the center just because that's being a little stubborn on cutting away. And I'm going to use the flat of the blade to clean all the way out. And this is the point where you start to feel it. If you feel this start to give way, just clean up your surface and stop trimming. Because if it's starting to sort of flex on you, it's either A, too wet, or B, the very bottom of the pot is getting very thin and you're about to trim through it. You do not want to trim through your pieces. Now I'm gonna lay my pen tool over this and I'm gonna take a look from the side, and I'm gonna look to make sure there's between 1/8 to 1/4 inch of space between the pen tool and the highest point in that sort of indented center. So at this point I have that, so that's perfectly fine. By indenting this, we can actually apply glaze here. We can never apply glaze to any surface that's going to directly touch the kiln shelves, because otherwise it's going to melt to the kiln shelf and you will lose your piece. So now I'm just gonna go through and I'm gonna clean up the edge, because it's a little bit messy after my trimming, and I don't like how angled that got. Right, so I'm gonna clean this up. And now I'm gonna take my sponge and I'm gonna kind of clean up the outside edge just to make sure all my lines kind of go away from trimming. You can also leave the trimmed lines, that's okay. It just kind of depends on if it looks good with your piece. And I am also gonna use a sponge on the very corner of this, on both inside and outside, because when I glaze this, I don't want sharp edges, because what's gonna happen when I glaze it is I'm gonna end up with glass on that surface, and sharp edges with glass on them equals a piece that's just gonna cut your hand, which you don't want. All right, so I'm gonna see if there's anything else I need to clean up. And at this point, mark the piece with your name, either in this bottom section, or not necessarily your full name. You can also just do your initials, because you, as much as you may think so, you will not be able to identify your piece from other people's unless it has some major identifier about it when it comes out of the kiln. So now I'm gonna take a look at this. That removed a significant amount of weight. Now the walls are pretty even. I've still got plenty of space on the bottom, so I could have actually trimmed a little more and made this foot a little higher, but notice how that completely changes the sort of profile of it. It gives it a lot of lift and makes it seem a lot lighter. And that is the basics of trimming on the potter's wheel.